Um, Hello, everybody. I'd like to thank all of you for your presence in our Interdisciplinary Research Hub for the second presentation. And before we introduce our speaker for the night, Osama, I'd like to begin with a few announcements. So we are in the midst of a series of seminars by MIAS, and it's called World and Letter, Book and Speech. It's essentially a series of seminars on Ibn Arabi and the place of the letter in his works. One seminar has already taken place on the 10th of April. The next one is on the 17th of April by Stephen Hertenstein, and it's on the letter Vav and the significance of the letter Vav in Ibn Arabi's work. After that, on the 24th of April, we have a seminar by Todd Lawson on the Fusus al-Hikam and Ibn Arabi's alphabet of prophets, form, and spirit in the Fusus al-Hikam. And then on the 1st of May, the series of seminars ends with a panel discussion with all the speakers. So join if you haven't already been following it. It's really interesting. Also take a look at the MIAS education page on the website. It is really beautiful and it is up and running, and you can find all the information you need regarding the beautiful programs and courses that are being conducted. And also I just found that there's a course calendar in the education page, and it's really useful to keep ourselves updated of the courses that are coming ahead in the year. And in the education section, there's also a section on the MIAS Voyagers, who these are students who have already taken these courses, and they have submitted their writings and their views and their opinions and their thoughts about the topics that have been discussed in these courses. So do check that out, and check out Osama's contributions. Really interesting. I really found it really interesting. He's talking about the complexity of binary oppositions, especially between manifestation and non-manifestation and other such binaries in the work of Ibn Arabi, and how to think about them. And I also want to mention about a project which is in the making with the MIAS Interdisciplinary Research Hub, which is that we're planning a book club, and we're thinking of beginning with Corbyn's Alone with the Alone, which is on spiritual imagination in Ibn Arabi. And we haven't started, we are still planning on the dates and everything. So if you want to join in, you can send Rim perhaps a mail, or join our WhatsApp group. So those are the announcements. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Osama is a second-year student in the University of Minnesota. He's a student of sociocultural anthropology. His project is really focused on a Sufi silsila in Pakistan, which is the Naqshbandia Owaisiah silsila. And his interests include concepts like presences, subjectivity, affect, and another thing that I found really interesting in that education page is Osama talking about how he looks at these Sufi practices as sort of alternative means of provincializing universalist notions, and I really loved the way he put that phrase. So Osama, would you like to sort of elaborate on these concepts maybe, and then maybe situate your today's presentation within your broad interests in your project, and then I'll intervene with just one statement about time, and then we can start with the presentation.
On provincializing, yes, provincial. I've taken this word from Chakrabarti, his work on provincializing Europe, um, who basically critiques universalist categories, which sort of fail to speak to um, how they are lived in different parts of the world. So I was interested, and a lot of people have done this already, but I was interested in how we can think um, about categories like desire. In Freud, for instance, how desire, for instance, is talked about. Um, and when we say Freud, we also sort of imply like how desire is understood universally as and how consequently human subjectivity is understood as a play between those desires, where the subject sort of wrestles with the death drive and the pleasure principle, um, and but so provincial, yeah, and in so I should say something about what I've written on the page, and then later I should start with the presentation. In this particular presentation, I will be talking about desire a little bit, um, but it's mostly going to be through Deleuze and not Freud. Um, and Deleuze sort of critiques Freud's understanding of desire, um, which I will get to in a bit. But in terms of my project, yeah, so I'm interested in looking at these categories of subjectivity, for instance. What does it mean um, in the context of selves? That's one of the questions that I asked in my proposals also is, what does subjectivity mean in the context of selves that are temporally and spatially unbounded in the case of people with himma, for instance, or in the case of practitioners of Zikr? How can we conceive of selfhood in that context? How do people register their passage between being one with God and ensuring their distance from God in their everyday lives? How do people then also register their passage between temporality and eternity? Because time, of course, is associated with the cosmos, with materiality, whereas in the experience of the divine, um, it's outside of the bounds of space and time, where all, and I'll get into those things maybe, I guess, during the presentation. But yeah, I'm also, I know, Bharatwaj, that you also are interested in looking at sort of the theorizations of um, Islamic philosophy as having something meaningful to contribute in these universal discussions on um, some of those themes, on memory, for instance, that you talked about earlier in the last presentation. And similarly, I'm also interested in sort of complicating these categories through the philosophy of people like Ibn Arabi, Ghazali, but also Sufi practitioners in the present day, where on the basis of which I sort of, and yeah, do you want to say some things before I should begin with presentation, Bharatwaj?
No, I think that was really useful, and it situated your presentation, what you aim to do in within the sort of broad interest that you come with. So I just, as I said, I think we can start, and maybe the presentation could be about 20-30 minutes, and then the rest of the time we could discuss. Um, so yeah, I
Yeah,
think.
I want to speak as little as possible because this is a great space and opportunity for me to learn more than speak. Um, and so I want to say a few things before getting on. And it's really difficult to sort of, and also um, a little nerving to sort of follow up on Bharatwaj's presentation, which I thought was fascinating. Um, And I would have been pretty chill about today's presentation, but Bharatwaj's talk last time was so profound that I thought that I had to, put some extra work on it. And I wasn't, because it's that time of the semester, but um, I'll just say a few things before beginning. So as Bharatwaj said, I'm a student of anthropology, which means that I have to derive or come to any kind of understanding of theory through my ethnography, through the lived experiences of people that I interview or spend time with. And so I try to remain as far as possible from abstract theory, although I am deeply inspired by some of those thinkers. And so that's one thing that I want to flag, is that as an anthropologist, all of that has to come, everything that I say has to come from the field, and not just from books, but from people's lives. And since I have not been able to do fieldwork properly because of the pandemic, I will be starting in the summer. My presentation is going to sound more like a proposal. There's not going to be anything definitive that I say or any claims that I will be making, but just some things that I found interesting and some things that I want to further explore during the summer. And so my engagement is not going to be as profound with theory, is not going to be as profound as Bharadwaj's, but I hope I can, have put something on the table so that we can have a meaningful discussion. So starting with Zikr, just a brief introduction of what Zikr is. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with it. It's a form of contemplative devotion or a ritualized remembrance that is deeply associated with Sufism. And it's practiced in different ways, in different silsilas and orders. And the order that I'm interested in working with is called Naqshbandia Owaisiah, like Bharadwaj said. And it uses breath, the imagination, and the imagination of light to sort of cultivate the spirit and prepare it to transcend from the body. So that's the very crude belief and workings of the ritual. So breath, I also made a PowerPoint presentation, and this is the first time I've made a PowerPoint presentation since I came to grad school. So it's a really bland PowerPoint, a white page with a few sentences. I could share the screen if I'm the co-host.
Yeah, I just made you a co-host, Osama, so I should be able to do it.
All right. So, yeah. Can you see the screen? Yes? Okay. So, and imagination are the three things that, and the name of Allah are the four things that are involved in the practice of Zikr in the silsila of Naqshbandia Owaisiah. And I will talk about this in more detail later, but the brief idea is that the body is used in particular kinds of ways. The body is disciplined in particular kinds of ways to cultivate the strength in spirit for it to transcend and go through these mystical stations, realms. Practitioners in their everyday life, some very devoted practitioners in their everyday life can speak to people in graves, for instance. They can speak to their loved ones. They can see their own selves in the future. They describe their lives as cassette tapes, as something that's preordained, an unfolding of life that is akin to, although that is not the focus of the presentation, this idea about destiny or necessity and freedom, but just some broad words that I'm using to introduce Naqshbandia Owaisiah as a silsila to you guys. So these individuals during the practice of Zikr breathe with the thought of Allah, and every breath is exhaled and inhaled, not just with the thought of Allah, but also with the thought of light coming into the spirit absorbing that light and then transcending. And I'll talk about the complexity of these four things in a bit more detail later. But I just wanted to say a few things about the title, Breaths of Intimacy. People in the silsila, since breath is really important in the silsila, they use different kinds of words. They say pass and fast, for instance. They say saans ki nazdiki. And it's also a word that I came across in Bezels of Wisdom, and I was trying to locate it yesterday, but I couldn't. But it's also, again, it's a universal concept, things like fana and baka in Sufism, and similarly breath, like Ibn Arabi talks about breath as well a lot, and that again is very important for Sufi thought generally. So breath, light, and imagination in Ibn Arabi. So breath, light, and imagination, all three are creative acts for Ibn Arabi. When he talks about breath, for instance, he's talking about the entire existence of the cosmos as a result of an expiration of divine reality. When God basically breathed cosmos into life. It's a creative act, and he calls it the breath of the merciful. Mercy itself is associated with creativity. And these are very brief introductions, but there's a chapter on breath in Bezels of Wisdom. There's a chapter on light. There's a chapter on reality and imagination. Light, similarly, is again an agency of creation. It is associated with creating the cosmos by casting its shadow. And the cosmos is understood as a shadow, but it's also quite complicated in a dual sense, because the shadow is the latent essence of all contingent beings in the cosmos. So the shadow is light in a sense, and is made visible through the light as well. The latent essence is quite interesting because the latent essence is the spirit. All contingent beings and their latent essence is the spirit, which is Amr, which is made of divine light. But it is also the shadow, which is made visible or made perceptible through light. I would like to read maybe one passage from that section on light in Bezels of Wisdom. So this is on page 123. The thing on which the divine shadow, called the cosmos, appears is the eternally latent essences of contingent beings. The shadow is spread out over them, and the identity of the shadow is known to the extent that the being of the original essence is extended upon it. It is by his name, the light, that it is perceived. The shadow extends over the essences of contingent beings in the form of the unknown unseen. So he's saying that this shadow is what is latent in all being contingent beings. And it is perceived through light, through his name. And Allah's name and light, there's sort of an indistinction between the two. Light is also understood by Ibn Arabi as that undifferentiated whole. And colors are understood as light in all its multiplicity and variation. So this passage, I think, really speaks to remembrance and Zikr is a running theme of Ibn Arabi's whole work, contemplation, remembrance. But I thought that this particular passage was quite interesting in sort of bringing us into this play between light, name, and shadow, or spirit and spirit's enlightening. So he's saying that it is by his name, the light, that the shadow is perceived. So his name is the light, and the light is what makes the shadow perceivable. So the light is also a creative act, and so is imagination. He's talking about the divine cosmos being God basically dreaming the cosmos. And there's this imagination is doubly layered in the sense that there's a macrocosmic scale which sort of creates the world and cosmos and everything. But at the microcosmic scale, every individual also has that imaginative faculty that allows that individual to access the realm where all subject-object binaries cease to be. And that idea is also really important for Ibn Arabi, because he's talking about, this idea of becoming a perfect man is very deeply associated with this realization of subjects and object binaries being an illusion, and that the doctrine of oneness of being sort of speaks about there being indistinction. And indistinction may be the wrong word to use here, but that there is no being but God. So there is only God. So light is God, the word of Allah is God, the name of Allah is God, imagination is that, the same reality, breath, everything, all of that. And in the practice of Zikr, it's really interesting, because the spirit, of course, we know is Amr. It's eternal. It is made of light, and it will not cease to be. And the spirit also absorbs light, which is the tajalli, known as tajalli in Urdu, for instance. And that is done through an inner recitation of Allah's name, which is also light. And so there's this path to realizing or becoming the perfect man needs to be traveled through remembrance for Ibn Arabi, and a kind of ritualized remembrance that sort of has an interaction of imagination, the use of breath, and imagination of light, and the word and the name of Allah, recitation of the name of Allah, which is also light, sort of allows the spirit to transcend the body and experience oneness. Because Ibn Arabi said, and I'll maybe get onto this later. So this is basically Zikr in Naqshbandia Owaisiah, and the significance of breath, light, and imagination in a very crude sense in Ibn Arabi. And I'm hoping that if there's any shortcomings in this, in my understanding, you guys will contribute and correct them. So what does Deleuze say, and why is Deleuze important here? He's important here in the moment because I'm taking a course on him this semester. So he's just right now very relevant in my life. I'm reading him all the time. But I really like Deleuze because, and ever since I honestly read Ibn Arabi, I see Ibn Arabi through every thinker, and sort of every thinker trying to talk about the same sort of things, and there's always a resonance. So with Deleuze, he's basically talking about aberrant movements, and these aberrant movements are desires that seek to escape determinate form. So there's a violence that accompanies embodiment. And that violence, it's really interesting because I was thinking while preparing for this that it links to Bharadwaj's talk as well, because this violence can also be seen as when the spirit is embodied, is put into the body, is confined into the body, that marks its originary forgetting in the Quran. And I thought that, I'll come to that a bit about memory and primordial past also, but I thought just a tangential note that this violence, because this also speaks to the duality or the conflict in Ibn Arabi between cosmic animality and spirituality, that there is a conflict between the spirit and the animality of the cosmos or the body or anything that is material. Or one could also say nafs, perhaps, which is the source of desires that accompanies embodiment or materiality. And the desire of the spirit is to return to oneness and remember that truth, whereas the desire of nafs sort of conflicts with the desire of the spirit. So there is a violence of form, of bodies, of embodiment that Deleuze is speaking about, and that I also thought Ibn Arabi spoke about. So he's saying that and he's talking, he calls these determinate forms concrete assemblages, aberrant movements. And he's talking about he's analyzing painters and writers and different kinds of literary critics, etc. But he's basically saying that these aberrant movements, these desires, sort of brings one out of their own body. It is an attempt to escape from one's own self into the groundlessness where all subject and object divisions cease to exist. Which is very interesting because this intensive of or ideal matter that he's talking about, or the unconscious, one could call it, is an undifferentiated whole where there are no subject-object divisions, where there is one reality as such. And in order to interact or contact that ideal matter or the unconscious, one always tries to escape from one's own body. But but form is violent and it suppresses those movements. The body is violent and the determinate form is violent. But at the same time, the body must also be used. Although it is violent, it is only through the practices of the body that the spirit can be enlightened. So it is only through disciplining the body in particular kinds of ways, not engaging in some kinds of material relations. Fasting, which is another one, let's say one kind of disciplining of the body. Head movement with breath, with the imagination of light, is another kind of disciplining of the body. And this disciplining of the body in relation with other bodies is what harnesses the imagination. This is what Spinoza also talks about. People have read about Spinoza's emphasis on imagination as a path toward realizing the intellectual love of God, he says. So, although the body is violent and its desires conflict with the desires of the body, its desires conflict with the desires of the spirit, it is indispensable and it needs to be harnessed in ways that can allow us to tap into imagination. And the kind of vision that Deleuze talks about that sort of sees into this ideal matter or contacts ideal matter is what he calls trance vision, which is where all subjective and objective aspects of being sort of cease to be. He calls this groundlessness the immemorial of memory, which I think is, again, very relevant to what Bharat was talking about, the primordial past. A memory that is not our memory. It is not a memory of our body. It is a remembrance of a primordial truth that exceeds our personhood and that exceeds our form. And Heidegger, like you were talking about, Heidegger talks about this when he says that all human beings are marked by an originary forgetting. So Deleuze is basically pushing us to access this immemorial of memory by escaping from one's own self and by allowing these aberrant movements to resist the violence of determinate form. This is what Deleuze is saying. So groundlessness in Ibn Arabi and Zikr. So Ibn Arabi says that in the experience of the divine, and he says this at various points, so I don't have a citation for it, but in the experiences of the divine, the signified and signified is one reality. What is named, the name and what is named, they are both one reality. And so in that experience, he says that it is God experiencing himself through his creation. And his creation is also none other than he. So this idea of groundlessness, where there are no distinctions between subjects and objects, one can also find in Ibn Arabi. And one also finds in the practice of Zikr, where the name of Allah, the Tajalli, and the Ruh, there seems to be an indistinction where there is no clear, neat demarcation of what is the subject and what is the object. So that is the groundlessness that allows for Ibn Arabi to remember, or to awaken from the dream, as Prophet Muhammad also says, and Ibn Arabi quotes, that life is a dream and you wake up from it when you die. So this idea of there being groundlessness is, again, very intimately, I think, tied to this doctrine of oneness of being, where the undifferentiated whole casts, if we understand it through the metaphor of light, casts all these shadow in multiplicity, in variation, but itself that whole realm is devoid of any kinds of subjects and objects, because there is no object and there is no other, there is only that reality. And this is also one thing that marks a perfect man, who realizes, not like we are realizing perhaps through theoretical understanding, but through the spirit, that he sees the latent essence in all being, in its variation. So he sees God, the face of God, in everything. And so whenever I've sort of practiced Zikr with other practitioners, there's been a lot of times when people start, for instance, weeping. People next to me would start weeping. And you have to close your eyes when you're performing Zikr. So I would resist opening my eyes to see who's weeping and, ask them questions about whatever. But oftentimes their responses would be like they can't respond to it. They don't have the words for it. They say that this does not belong to language. This is outside of language. This is outside of time and space. So there is no way to encapsulate how I felt. This is the rough blueprint of general answers that I get whenever I am too curious about someone's, emotional outburst during the Zikr. And I thought that this idea of groundlessness and oneness sort of speaks to ineffability, because for Saussure, who's famous for language, his theory on language and signs, for Saussure, what makes a sign is essentially difference. That a chain of signifiers, a relation of signifiers, is in a differential relation with a chain of signifieds. So for there to be language, there needs to be difference. For there to be signs, there needs to be difference. But in the context of oneness, where Zikr practitioners are experiencing God, or the God is experiencing himself through those Zikr practitioners, in that experience, in the groundlessness where the light, the ruh, the name, the distinction sort of cease to be, that sort of, I think, is an interesting aspect to explore or make sense of practitioners' ineffability, or their inability to articulate their experience or find the right words for their experience, or to make sense of why they're saying that they don't have the words. So maybe we could go back to page 123 again, to talk about this ineffability. So the last paragraph of 123 says, "No more is known of the cosmos than is known from a shadow, and no more is known of this reality than one knows of the origin of a shadow. Insofar as he has a shadow, he is known. But insofar as the form of the one casting the shadow is not perceived in the shadow, the reality is not known. For this reason, we say that the reality is known to us in one sense and unknown to us in another." He's also talking about the quality of shadows being black and opaque. So he's saying, have you not observed that shadows tend to be black, which indicates their imperceptibility by reason of the remote relationship between them and their origins? So it's a shadow that extends over all essences of contingent beings in the form of the unknown and the unseen. It is black, which indicates its imperceptibility. Perhaps I think this passage and this chapter is also useful in trying to make sense of the inability to describe their experiences because the experiences involve their shadows, which are not easily given to representation or easy meaning. So that's one aspect of it. So I think a conversation, and I don't know as of now why a conversation between Deleuze and Ibn Arabi or Sufism is even necessary. Why do we need to situate Sufism in Deleuze's vocabulary? Why can't Sufism be its own thing and Deleuze being its own thing? But I just find it interesting to see those resonances, because it seems to me that in Deleuzean vocabulary, one could talk about the practice of Zikr as a path toward escaping from determinate form, being unbounded temporally and spatially, because in that experience, outside of time, space, and signifiers and signifieds in oneness, all those things cease to be. So it seems to me that this conversation in Deleuzean vocabulary would be quite interesting to think about Zikr as a path towards allowing us a contact with ideal matter, or the unconscious, or the primordial past that is forgotten. That's just one thing that recently it has been quite interesting to me, because unconscious is explored through, like the last presentation, the unconscious was a very key part of this idea of awakening, and spirits awakening to primordial knowledge, to knowledge that, they're forgotten as a result of being in the body, the violence of the body, the violence of determinate form, and trying to make the spirit remember through reaching groundlessness in Deleuzean vocabulary, through reaching a space where these distinctions between light, subject, object, rule, all these things sort of disappear, and there is oneness. And then try to think about their inability to articulate it, because language also requires difference, and for Saussure, I think. So, this is the ethnographic side of my research, I guess. Interested in how practitioners in their everyday lives register experiences of their spirit in their minds, experiences that their bodies did not experience. So for instance, when we are on our way to the Prophet's mosque in the heavens, in Murshidabad, while being stationed, the practitioner sitting next to me starts weeping. Now, why is that practitioner weeping? How is it possible for the body to react so intensely to an experience that the body did not go through, but the spirit went through? So that sort of also gestures at the power of imagination, sort of sharing in with divine reality. Foucault also talks about this in the context of dreams, where he says that in dreams, there is a derealization of the subject. So there is no subject in dreams. So in that context, how can we understand subjectivity when selves are temporally and spatially unbounded? When someone in Pakistan, Murshidabad, could be in Murshidabad while he weeps as his spirit traverses to different kinds of, goes to Mecca to perform the tawaf, or goes to the Prophet's mosque, or to the Arsh, or to the different stations, through imagination, breath, light, and head movement. So how do we understand subjectivity in that context? And tied to this question is, how do we understand or complicate Freudian understandings of desires and drives? When we think about the conflict between the violence of the body, or nafs, or maybe this is too neat a correlation, but between the source of drives being, between nafs as the source of desires, and between the spirit's desire, which is innate, according to Ibn Arabi, to return to being, to return to oneness. He says that we are all on a straight path to an inevitable return. So that, how do we conceptualize drives and subjectivity in that context? And how do practitioners register their passage between effacement and subsistence, and temporality and eternity? So effacement and subsistence in the context of identifying with God during the practice of Zikr. And then as soon as it ends, going back to their everyday lives of being a businessman, a lawyer, a student, or anything else. And how are these experiences sort of shaping their everyday activities? I mean, there's a whole ethnographic side that I think is maybe slightly tangential to Ibn Arabi and this reading group. But broadly, I'm interested in how the sacred remains sacred when it is instrumentalized in everyday practice. So how individuals in their everyday lives be with God and then not be with God, and then during Zikr identify and not identify, and how is that sort of registered in their bodies and memory. So those are roughly thoughts. I'm sorry, this is a very bland presentation and a PowerPoint, but yeah, I think Ibn Arabi, it's just every chapter when you go back to it is so rich that it's difficult to know where to start from, or how to speak, I guess. But yeah, I think there's an interesting conversation happening between Deleuze and his ideas of violence of determinate form and the unconscious, and having a contact with that unconscious in the groundlessness where there are no divisions between subject and object. And I think Ibn Arabi's idea of there being no signify and signified, what is named, the name and what is named being the same thing, sort of allows us access to. So, I mean, I don't know how a Deleuzean scholar would respond to someone saying one way you could, access this is through Zikr, so you should just start ritualized contemplation. But yeah, I'm interested in hearing what or how I could possibly think about this further or revise some of my questions, or what you think generally. I can stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, Osama. That was really, I mean, those questions were really both important and interesting and exciting, and I loved especially the Deleuzian, which is the main thing, but then especially the point about determinate forms and the violence of that, and how that can be connected to the question of Zikr. And it was really interesting, and I think there'll be a lot of questions about the presentation. So I'd like to open the forum for discussions and questions. Or maybe I can ask the first one. If I mean, I was just jotting down one question which I just wanted to, Osama, answer this first, then go ahead. That was what I was thinking when you were presenting. So maybe I'll just ask that one question that I have. When you were talking about, now I might, because my Deleuze is weak, so I don't know if I don't remember all of it, but I saw a connection with the notion of telos as the goal of a particular object, let's say, and how form is essentially connected to telos, to the goal of a particular. So the form is determinate because it has a goal, or in more Aristotle terms, the form is determinate because it has to perform a function, and if it has to perform a function, it has to be a certain way. Indeterminacy wouldn't allow it to do its function. Now, this is the Deleuzian part. Now with Zikr, and I may be wrong here too, but there is a sense in which the physical act of Zikr doesn't have it does have an ultimate telos, which is a divine one, but one could, the very act itself seems to be circular. It seems to not follow a linear telos. It's not really, you don't remember God, you don't mention God's names repeatedly, you don't repeat his name for the sake of a particular determinate goal. So you do it for, there is a telos which itself is indeterminate. So what I'm trying to maybe ask you is, have you thought of, say, the connection between the violence of this linear goal seeking, which form a formal structure implicates, and how in Zikr maybe that is broken. And here I think this is a more existential type of how in the act of Zikr maybe the and its non-linearity could be that groundless space where form and its determinacy could dissolve.
So on Deleuze, I have to admit, I mean, there's so much literature that Deleuze has produced, and it's so difficult to understand it. I don't know if I can claim with any certainty what I'm saying. I don't think there's a telos in Deleuze.
Osama, I mean, there's a disturbance in your mic, I guess. So there's a lag in your sound. Or it's just, is it my?
Is it the sound of the fan, or is it?
No, now it's good. Now it's
better, yeah.
Okay. So I was just saying that I can't claim to speak on Deleuze authoritatively because I haven't read all of his literature. But in terms of that question about there being a telos, I think Deleuze says that the entire purpose of aberrant movements is sort of to not only escape the form of the body or any determinate form, but to reconfigure it as well. So a new form emerging, and then a new form emerging after that. So there's a constant reconfiguration of determinate forms. And he would be very much against telos, I think. And in the context of, I like I said, I'm not super confident about saying that he's against any idea of teleology, but it seems to me that he thinks that if you ascribe teleology to anything, a predetermined goal to anything, then the aberrance of movement sort of goes away. Because what makes movements aberrant is its ability to challenge any kind of preconceived ideas or ground, which is why he calls it the groundlessness. But there is no goal or predetermined, but there's a constant desire to escape, to reconfigure form, to escape form. And it could be an interesting link to think about how practitioners are reconfigured in their everyday lives after performing Zikr, how their material relations are reconfigured, people, for instance, accept employment opportunities or marriage proposals based on spiritual premonition. So they're very realist, very deeply reconfigured in their everyday lives too. But in the context of telos, that would be a very interesting question to think about how telos is playing a role in the context of Zikr by asking practitioners about what kinds of things, what are their wishes and desires or ideals in their everyday life, why are they here, what are their anticipations when they're visiting the gravesite, for instance, how was their experience when they left the gravesite, and all these questions. I think it would be interesting to see the role telos plays But I think that your point about circularity and repetition is quite interesting. Um, the non-linearity, like you said, of Zikr, uh, the repetition of breathing, the repetition of head movement, the repetition of reciting Allah's name. Uh, there is that notion of circularity there. And I think we talked about repetition when you spoke, Bharatwaj, as well. How would repetition feature in that discussion um, when we talked about dance, for instance, and movement? I was thinking about whirling dervishes in a sense.
Osama, we still have troubles hearing you. Earlier, when you did the presentation, was great, but your voice is coming and going. I wonder if you can get closer to the microphone at all?
Okay, I'll try again. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, now it's good.
Yeah, I was just saying your point about repetition and circularity. That's really interesting. Um, I don't know how much of it you heard already, my response to Bharatwaj's question. But we talked about repetition when you spoke, Bharatwaj, as well. Um, when, can you hear me?
Yes, suddenly better.
Okay. Okay. So that sound, I thought the sounds of, was that a fan sound that you guys could hear from my, yeah, it was, my fan's off. I'm partially sweating here. So I don't know where the sound was coming from. Maybe it's just the internet. But yeah, this question about repetition is really interesting. What is the role of repetition here in accessing the unconscious? And what is the role of circularity against linearity? Because linearity, like you said, Bharatwaj, supposes a teleology, that there's a predefined goal that you want to aspire to and you get there. But with circularity, there's this negation of that telos. This is a really interesting thing, and I'll think about this further.
Yeah.
I think I can hear the sound from Bharatwaj's camera.
Oh, is it?
But it's fine. I can hear you. It's fine.
Yeah, yeah. Is
That's
it
better, yes. Thank you.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know that. I thought the fan is off, so I didn't know that. Sorry. I think Richard had a question.
Comment. Thank you. It's a fascinating mix in your what you're looking at. So you're looking at now Deleuze. Is it Deleuze? How you pronounce it? And the practice of Zikr within the Naqshbandia. It's the fact that because you're an anthropologist, you've got to actually present it in an anthropological manner. So that actually brings it to the human, to the individual person. I also thought it fascinating, this idea of the violence. And there's because if you look the early universe, you see the end was extremely violent. What brought us all together, brought the earth together. We live in this very peaceful little corner of a side galaxy somewhere. But actually, it's incredible violence which has brought it about. We get reminded of that when the volcanoes go off in the Caribbean now. It's just under the surface. There's this, and the process, the whole process of arrival and being born is quite violent process. There's a sort of splitting open of the womb and the arrival of the child, and it's we forget that there are these things they get forgotten about, and often death can be violent too. But there's this process of actual. It's like being a plant, a seed planted in the ground. You squash it into the ground and you say, ya carbid, ya basit, because it has to be constricted in order for it to contact the earth and then grow. So you've got all that going on. Once was at a Zikr years ago in Istanbul, And they did a practice called breaking the knot of manifestation, and which was fairly violent, I have to say, and in terms of its activity. But it was, it's something you said about just a couple of very interesting things about this idea of the shadow. The shadow is to do with imagination. You can't really explain what's happening to you in the Zikr because it's to do with the shadow, and that was quite. You can't actually, that can't be expressed, and that this is sort of releasing this idea that we've been confined, constricted, and that there's this breaking out in the Zikr. That's the opening of the heart. That takes place. There's this so you're both created and uncreated, and there's this difference between the signified and the signifier is conflated. So I think it's a very rich and interesting area that you're being taken into, and I look forward to more. Thank you. So I haven't really got a question.
Thank you. The way you put it about breaking out of the body, breaking out, I really like that term, breaking out. I think Deleuze would also use that word to talk about escaping from, determinate from. I wish I had shown you guys some paintings that Deleuze analyzes, because it's really interesting the way he talks about movement in immobility. So in those paintings, the figures are moving, but they're stationed. They're trying to escape from their own self. And you can see there are, like, the figure is in movement, and they're, fragmented figures with limbs going off here and there. But I'm talking about Francis Bacon, the French painter. If some of you have seen his paintings. So, and here, this idea about movement in immobility is really interesting. When I think about Zikr, stationed bodies sitting next to the grave, that kind of movement while being stationed with your eyes closed and breathing, and that movement through these different realms that deeply affects people's lives. But yeah, breaking out the spirit, breaking out of the body to experience oneness. It's a nice way to put it. Thank you.
Inna has a hand up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. Oh my gosh, on so many levels. So I'll try and restrain it, but I'm also very interested in ideas around breath, particularly in the poetry of Iqbal, and the way he uses nafs and ruh in these really interesting ways, and particularly in how he understands the poetic or the artistic role as fundamentally a kind of a sharing in this breath of the angels. So I'm just wondering, as you were talking about breath and imagination, whether the category of inspiration features in as a sort of literal inspiring breathing, whether that's something that's sort of coming into your research or is related. That's it really for now.
No, I haven't thought about inspiration. It's really interesting. I've always wanted to read Iqbal properly. I feel like it's a sin being, Pakistani and not reading the national poet. But also because he's considered as someone who's, he also did Zikr. We know that he was into ritualized remembrance. This poetry he wrote on Shikwa, Jawab-e-Shikwa. That's the only thing that I've read, so I can only speak to that. But yeah, I would be very interested to see how breath and inspiration, as addressed in Iqbal's poetry, would read into some of my conversations here. Because the only way through which I understand breath as of now is through Ibn Arabi, which I think is sufficient. I take Ibn, of course, but like I'm thinking about, unconscious through some other thinker. I was curious how to think about breath through some other person as well. Iqbal would be great, because Iqbal is, he's revered as someone who's into ritualized contemplation, remembrance, that his poetry is divinely inspired. So with these ideas, and these ideas are held by practitioners of Naqshbandia Owaisiah as well. So it would make complete sense for me to explore Iqbal, and that's something that I've been, asking my father to sort of sit down with me one day and read, because, he's into it as well. But yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring inspiration and breath along with Ibn Arabi and this whole thing. Yeah, thanks for that recommendation.
Lucy had a question.
Hi, Osama. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very, very much. One of the things that sort of just came to mind as you were talking was the distinction or difference between the physical body and the lived body. By which I mean the physical body is governed by temporality, it's linear, whereas the lived body is really is much more in the realm of imagination, it's much more non-linear. And I wondered if this had informed any of your thinking.
That's really interesting, to complicate the body itself, because right now I'm thinking about complicating selves through body spirit, which is already done, in a lot of places, to think about the body differently, to think about time, because I would be very interested in sort of exploring this further. I've read a bit of Walter Benjamin, and Bergson on time. And so Benjamin, for instance, it's really interesting to see how, there's a linear time, homogeneous empty time that we sort of are a part of. But there's also that non-linear messianic time that he talks about, which brings, and it's really interesting because he talks about messianic moment as a moment that brings something forgotten into newness. That's, I think, something along those lines he says, which is an experience of the body that is sort of split between two times, it seems, between a time of the linear physical body day to day, but also the time of the imagination, like you said, of images that sort of resist the neat distinctions of past, present, and futures, where the past seeps into the present and haunts the present, where it's not relegated neatly into the past. So yeah, those ideas about challenging linearity and temporality through thinking about bodies differently, as there being a physical body and the lived, experienced, the experience of time through duration, for instance, as Bergson talks about durational time, that is different from the time of modernity or capitalism that sort of says one after one makes three. That, yeah, it's a really interesting aspect. I guess body, I would be interested in exploring some thinkers on phenomenology as well, affect and body, that would be really useful. But yeah, there's I need to focus a bit more on this aspect of the body. It's a really interesting aspect. Hopefully in the summer. There's a never-ending list of reading.
You mentioned Spinoza. Have you read Deleuze's book on Spinoza?
Yeah, Expressionism in Philosophy. I did that last semester. Fascinating.
Fabulous book. Yeah. Good. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed that. Thank you.
There's also a lecture by Ibrahim Khalil on Ibn Arabi and temporality, which is in the MIAS podcast page. There's I forgot the name of the lecture, but it was done at one of the events of the Ibn Arabi Society, and so it is uploaded on the MIAS podcast page. And it's a really good exploration by him. He's a Mullah Sadra scholar, and it's a very interesting exploration of temporalities in Ibn Arabi. So it's maybe that could connect with Lucy's question and perhaps with what you're thinking about the lived and the and this sort of objective time.
Yeah.
So
Thank you so much.
yeah.
I'll definitely read this as well.
Right. Rim has a question.
Yes, thank you so much, Osama. That was really interesting. Really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. And also, I enjoyed the talk when you mentioned Deleuze, as he figures amongst my favorite thinkers. So thank you for that. I was having the thought when you were talking about Deleuze and how you go on to dive in a little bit deeper with his thought in relation to Ibn Arabi. I was wondering whether you came across, of course you must have, but whether you thought about the relationship with the concept of the rhizome, because Deleuze's concept of the rhizome speaks so perfectly with Ibn Arabi, this idea of the non-dualism, connections, heterogeneity, multiplicity. It's all in there. I mean, you said it yourself. You said, when I read Ibn Arabi, I see him in every thinker. And exploring a little bit more, I think the rhizomatic model of Deleuze would be very fruitful, because with Ibn Arabi we see that idea of explosion of, there is this multiplicity of the forms, of the meanings, and with Deleuze, I remember one of my favorite lines where he says, this rhizomatic model, it follows the lines of flight. So it's always, you never can really catch it. And while I was having this kind of thinking about the rhizome, there was this written essay by Suad Hakim. It figures, I'm more than happy to share the details with you. It figures in the MIAS Journal of 2016, and the title is The Path to God, A Journey Through the Spiritual Experience of Ibn Arabi and His Writings. And interestingly enough, she mentions divine uprooting. So this idea of uprootedness and the Deleuzian rhizome, I think it will give in such a nice thing. I would love to do another research now that you mentioned this. I'm tempted, but I won't. So perhaps I would know I would love to know more about how you would do that. But I would read something she says here, and then I will share more details. Is when she talks about this practice of the Zikr, and she talks about the divine uprooting, and she says how the divine snatches the spiritual seeker towards him. So without there being either stages or distance, one route of the human spirit towards God. And then she goes on and she says how the Sufi was chosen by God to receive a particular state with him, and this particular state passed through his body, and he was caught and held intimately there. And he was talking about the intimate breaths. So it's such a beautiful resonance. I will share that with you. I think you will enjoy that.
Yeah, I would love to read it. On your question about the rhizome, it's such a difficult concept to understand, but I definitely see resonance there. That this concatenation of all things in relation, and this idea about lines of light that sort of escape the circle. He says the circle is constricting. It's the ground. It is what confines. And so it was really interesting to see. So when the Zikr ends, usually in this practice, so they breathe with head movement, with every breath and head movement, sort of they're thinking about Allahu, Allahu, Allahu. And when that ends, they sit in silence. And the Sheikh sort of says, and I'm translating this into English, but he says that before your spirits can go to the Arsh or to these different mystical realms, they must pass through these three circles of love. And he says, the first circle of love is around your forehead. The second circle of love is bigger than the first circle of love, and it's around your forehead, and consequently the third. And then the lines of flight through those circles, I think, is where also that resonance between escaping the circle But because Deleuze has a lot on circles, I think. I don't know, this is a very rudimentary understanding. But circles sort of are violent in the sense of imposing forms. And lines of light are what break through those circles. And I thought that the vision that the Sheikh was saying was, very resonant with that. Rhizomes, I wish I could speak more to that. It's something that I've come across, but haven't ever truly understood. I understood rhizomes also a bit through Deleuze's reading of Spinoza, where he sort of says that Spinoza understands God through the concatenation of all things that are in relation with each other. And Deleuze obviously is also very inspired by Spinoza, Bergson, and Nietzsche. But rhizomes, I would love to add that, maybe read some of Deleuze's works over the summer to think about that connection with rhizomes. And I would love to talk to you about any interesting ideas that come up once I've done it. And please share the article with me.
Yeah, of course, no problem. And actually, since you mentioned again weeping, I think that was another crucial thing that you have mentioned. When we were little, we did not understand really the significance of that, because we were taught that when you say the Imam weeping or somebody reading the Quran weeping, that's part of the experience itself. But then quite recently, I was really interested in understanding a bit more how there is a relationship between this weeping and the meanings that Ibn Arabi uses. And perhaps one of the ways of linking that with the experience of dhikr is, because you mentioned the word passage, didn't you? And then with Ibn Arabi, he talks about this idea of the passage from this, the spiritual experience is a passage itself from transcending the body to the experience of the spirit. And as that passage takes place, he uses the word abara in Arabic, which means passage, and also it means as well so many things. It means like passage from one side of a river to another, but it also means weeping. It also means the experience of crying. So the passage as the experience of dhikr, as a passage that transcends the form of the body into the spirit, which might convey this idea of the weeping and the crying itself.
That's really interesting. I'll think about this. To think about weeping as a passage itself is interesting, because I'm reminded of what Deleuze also says on this idea: when thought touches matter, produces agony, he says. When thought, the unthought of thought, he says, the immemorial of memory, things like those. So, but where basically in that indistinction, that where thoughts touch matter and sort of try to escape determinate form, that is very agonizing for Deleuze. It sort of there may be a resonance with weeping and that. But I don't want to read, all Zikr practitioners or even Ibn Arabi through Deleuze. I don't want to privilege that over the experience of people and how they understand or what their vernacular theorizations of their own experience are. But this idea about passage is really interesting, and weeping. I'll think about this as well further. So Celia, you had your hand up.
Yes, a couple of things just to mention. We've been speaking about the weeping, but I don't know, in Ralkut or certainly in Sufis of Andalusia, do you have that book about the different kinds of saints which Ibn Arabi met while he was in Al-Andalus? And he talks there about how, how different, the different approaches of the saintly people, and some of them who weep. So I can't remember exactly where it talks about that, but some are ecstatic and some are given to weeping. So that might be a reference if you want to look that up. I don't know if I can find it for you. The other thing that struck me with regard to the body is I wondered whether you've looked at what Ibn Arabi says about God's vast earth, where the worship, the perfect adoration of God takes place. And he says that the earth of your body, this is the earth of your body, and that even when you die, that there's something of you in the earth. And I just looked up a reference. I mean, it's spoken about in several places, but just in case you need an immediate reference to look at, in Sufi Path of Knowledge. Do you have that book? By William Chittick? I think you can find it online, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I'll look it up online. Sufi Path?
It's this one. Very, very falling to pieces by copy. So all the pages are loose. It's the Sufi Path of Knowledge, subtitled Ibn al-Arabi's Metaphysics of Imagination. William Chittick, yeah. Okay. And, well, just to sort of read you just a little bit that I just found for you. It's in do you read Arabic, Futuhat 3? No? Oh. So, you know, it's translated by him. And I think Claude Dadas talks about it also in Quest for the Red Sulphur. You should know, dear brother, that the earth of your body is the true wide earth within which the real commanded you to worship him. This is because he only commanded you to worship him in his earth as long as your spirit resides in the earth of your body. When it leaves your body, this prescription by the law will drop away from you, even though your body will continue to exist in the earth, buried within it. Thus you know that this earth is nothing other than your body. He made it wide because of the faculties and meanings which are found only in this human bodily earth. And then it goes on. So you might be interested to explore that, what Ibn Arabi says about the earth of the body and how worship takes place within the body.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for that, and for weeping and ecstasy with those two kinds of different experiences in Sufis of Andalusia. I will definitely read all this. This is great literature and great feedback. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for your talk. I found it so interesting. Really. I'm not familiar with Deleuze, and it was very interesting. I mean, I was very pleased Richard said something about this idea of violence, because it does sound quite violent, you know, and Ibn Arabi talked, you know, I say very much about, you know, the integration of the body, you know, such as one transcends in a certain sense, but the importance of the body, which you did mention, it being indispensable, you know, in order for this worship to take place, and how the movement of the body is an integral part of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about this doubly layered sense of the body, which is both a form of, so he uses the word carnal, you know, animality, or to talk about the body, but also at other times it's significant in being the earth that is the medium through which we can make sense of the world and all. It's really interesting, all your feedback. And I also want to say this again, I'm also very unfamiliar with Deleuze. This is very rudimentary research proposal-like presentation. So just wanted to bracket that again.
So we are unfortunately at the end of our time together tonight. And thank you, Osama, for the presentation.